Welcome to episode 17 of Unscripted Let's Talk. This is Mary Eggleston, and today it's just me. I've been putting together some thoughts about how to help my listeners understand what it means to release trauma. You know, after the last episode when I interviewed Dr. Carol Nelson about how the brain is impacted by emotional trauma, and how it becomes trapped within the mind, I have been thinking about how can I communicate some hope and peace to you, those of you who listen to the podcast about recovering from abuse and neglect, especially from your childhoods. You know, it's so important to realize that a child does not know that a parent is messed up and or selfish and actually is mistreating them. A child's perspective is that mom and dad must know. They must know what they're doing. And so it must be something wrong with who I am and what I'm choosing to do. And so if you get parents who are very, very anxious and living on the edge themselves emotionally, they have reactions to the spontaneity of a child. You know, children do things that, are unexpected. And the children in a family with parents who really are so tense, anxious, worried, angry, selfish, they're going to have these reactions to a child of, there's something terribly wrong with you. Why would you do that? And just overreactions, which is really confusing to a child because, children have impulses. And so they try really hard then. A child tries really hard to not have the impulses that a child has. But of course, you can't pull that off because you are a child. And so what starts to happen is this belief that there is something defective about me, deeply, deeply defective about me. I am not giving the reactions that I'm supposed to give in order to win the love and sustain the love of my mother or father. I mean, I've had people tell me how they would practice their reactions to what they thought their parents might give them as a gift or do for them because they wanted to make sure they gave the right reaction because they didn't want to risk that feeling of abandonment and rejection. Now that's incredible, isn't it? You're going to practice your reactions because you so want your mom and dad to love you. And you think, well, what are the choices that a child has? You can do that, or you could act out and decide, well, then I am awful. I'll be awful. I'll do awful things. I'll just make it all come true because that's what they're saying I am anyway, which is, another thing that people tell me that that's what they stumbled on, although they don't tell it to me that way. They come in and they say, I was an awful person. I was an awful child. I didn't deserve to be loved. Look at the things I did. I acted out. I made my mom and dad's life hard. And I'll say to them, is there any other child you would say that about? Is there another child where you would walk in and judge them so harshly? And of course there never is. I'd say, well, no, I'd look at that and I would know that the child is reacting to something, in the home with the parents. I wouldn't have that reaction, but I do to me. And of course, what that is that they've taken it in so deeply into their own minds because of growing up in it and having it get deep into the brain that they struggle to offset that belief that there is something terribly wrong with them. And I mean on a deep level, like in their soul, defective. So the belief then is when a parent mistreats a child, either through emotional or physical or neglectful types of abuse. Neglect is an awful thing. Not enough attention maybe is given to neglect. Just a message to a child that you're not even supposed to be here. Like the joke that I'll hear from people, and they say it in kind of a dark way, and isn't always meant this way, but, I was the oops child. and that was really emphasized to them. Or I was the makeup child because the child before me wasn't quite right, so they had one more. Or I realize now I was the child that was born to keep my parents' marriage together. All of those things. And then, of course, a child can't keep a parent's marriage together. You can't be the solution to somebody else's problem. And then you're really, really not wanted. So it's like a parent holds up a mirror to the child and says, this is who you are. And the child believes it. So there's no way in the child's mind, no life reference that they would have to offset that. That, hey, maybe something's wrong with mom or dad. Maybe it's not supposed to be this way. So what happens then, of course, is that child, that person, develops ways to cope with the pain that they feel, and they store it in ways where they can go on with their lives. They're looking to be okay. You know, it's a funny thing. Anything that you see people doing, that seems kind of odd, they developed in response to something. I have this belief that we're all kind of trying to be okay, and we've come up with some goofy ways to do it. So you tuck it deep away into your mind, and you even come up with why it is okay that the abuse is happening. I have people all the time come in to me and say, well, everybody was hit with a belt. That's just what everybody did. Or everybody's mom and dad pinched their arms really hard and gave it a twist. I mean, everybody had. That's just what people did back then. That's just what happened. That's how my neighborhood was. That's how my family was. I mean, it's okay. And they know it's not, as they say it out loud, they know that doesn't sound okay. And of course, I gently say to them, it may be what everybody was doing. It never means it was okay. And the example I like to use for people is slavery. Everyone was doing it. Everyone was doing it. So you could justify and say, look, everyone's doing this. But I'm going to tell you something. It was wrong each and every time. Every time you hurt a child, another human being, it's wrong. It's wrong. Every time you come from a dark place within you and you project your own feelings of anger or disdain or self-loathing and take it out on someone who cannot fight back, whether a child, a slave, or perhaps even your pet. It's wrong every single time, and I don't care if everybody's doing it. Children are loyal to their parents, and they need to be accepted by them, so much so that, even a family that's an emotional disaster, they'll try to make that family look okay. But of course, they're guessing at what that would mean. What does it mean to look okay? I worked with a woman years ago who had a family where there was physical abuse, yelling, screaming, violence, and she became so pleasing to other people. She said, Mary, I had so many friends and I knew how to please everyone. I couldn't tolerate anyone being upset with me. I couldn't tolerate anyone not liking me. And of course, that was what was still going on in her life. And that's why she was coming in to see me. Because, life turns into a bit of a disaster when you have to please literally everyone around you. She said, I was homecoming queen. And I could never even have anybody over to my house. So there I am, homecoming queen. Wouldn't it seem like I'm the happiest kid of all? And she said, and I would go home and just try to not be screamed at or hit or in some way mistreated. And that was my life. And I developed this incredible ability to make everybody around me just feel all this harmony and love. And I was so skilled, and not one person knew me. So now she was 2 marriages and 2 divorces in from very abusive men. And she said, I have to figure out who I am. And I said a simple question to her. I said, well, what do you want? She said, and she sat and looked at me, well, and she said any number of things. She said, I don't know. I said, well, what would it look like? What would it feel like if you were loved? What would a day look like? What would a day sound like if you're with a partner and you feel loved? And she was just perplexed by these questions as we went through sessions of what is all this? And I said, what are you feeling in your body, even now, as I say this? And she said, my chest tightens. For some people, their stomach flips. For others, their chest tightens, or they get a strained feeling up in their neck. For her chest would just tighten and her heart would start beating fast. And I said, so is it possible that one of the feelings of love for you would be that your heart didn't have to beat fast? That your mind didn't have to worry about the next thing to say that might be right or wrong? This, of course, brought tears. And then I encouraged her to really allow the tears to flow. To really, really flow. Don't hold back, letting her know that her tears did not disappoint me, that with me her tears were welcomed and needed and necessary, and she began to sob. And there was some fear in the sobbing. Now realize I had tremendous rapport with this woman, or she would not have felt safe enough to do this. And eventually, she was holding onto one of the pillows in my office and sobbing and sobbing. And I was helping her release this with the things I was saying, with the comforting ways that I was telling her to let it all out. Too often when someone's crying, we say, shh, 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 shh. Oh, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay, which is actually designed to shut them up. I was saying, let it all out. Let it all out. And for her to move through this deep chunk of pain inside of her, to come through it, and then know that being able to feel safe emotionally would be the ultimate feeling of love. So where could she practice this with becomes the question. And it's interesting how much pets can make a difference. In this particular instance, she realized that she did feel safe with her puppy, with her dog. Her dog never judged her and really cared about her. It is one of the gifts of having pets, quite frankly, because the dog accepted every emotion, every reaction she had. And I started to help her tune into that little pet therapy. And then could that be transferred to at least a friendship where she could reveal a little bit of who she really is? And to discover which relationships were safe. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. To really get in touch with these things in your life, you have to be curious. You have to be curious about, why do I do the things I do? I make everyone around me feel good, and I don't feel good. I feel empty. Why do I do that? Do I really want to know? Can I go in and actually begin to love the child within me who felt so rejected and believed there was good reason for it? Do I dare do that? Which brings me to the second part. You need to be curious, and then you need to have tremendous courage to actually go in and get to know who you are. Many years ago, I realized when I was like, I don't know, in my mid to late 20s, I thought, well, this is interesting. The person I can most get to know, have the most intimate relationship with, is me. I have full access to me. And yet it's oddly difficult to truly get to know yourself. But I will tell you that until you really want to, it's like all these walls will stay up. All these chambers will stay closed until you exhibit true curiosity mixed with courage. Because some of what you're going to bump into, perhaps a lot at first of what you're going to bump into, is pain and grief. So the traumas that people experience are often behind a wall, and they're guarded by protective parts of the mind itself. Stories that the child and later the adult tell themselves in order to live through their day, in order to be okay. Just to give you an example of how we look to cleanse these stories in our mind, because we have to walk around and get through our day. I'm going to tell you of somebody whose name was Laura. And I had worked with her for quite a while. And I was wondering, what else is there to this story? This woman has such difficulty with being animated at all. People with tremendous trauma, they just kind of keep their voices flat. They never laugh really big. They never cry really big. They're very careful about the emotional range that they allow themselves, because they have such a fear that they could lose control, and then really, with their trauma, they often worry that then they would die. Because when your parents are being abusive to you or neglecting you and you're a child, you are afraid that you're going to be killed, that you're going to die. And so you think this is no small thing. So you learn to keep your emotions in a very tight area in your mind. Very, very small area. I don't get too happy. I don't ever laugh from my belly. And I don't cry from the depths of who I am. And so now I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent. When I walk out to greet people, especially for the first time, I joke a little bit with them. And however much they can respond to a little gentle humor tells me a little bit of where they're at. Because the more restricted you need to make your range of emotion tells me how much trauma you probably went through. So back to Laura. So I had been working with her for a long time, and just gently trying to talk to her about, why these difficulties with relationships, and why, the fear of, a good laugh or a good cry, all these different things. One day she came into me and she said, I was thinking about all these conversations we're having, and I thought, I probably should tell Mary that my brother raped me. And that pause, that's exactly what happened in the session. And I very carefully said to her, yes, that would be something for us to talk about. And in saying it out loud to someone who looked at her in the way that I did, I didn't take it too far because I knew that'd be too much for her, but I looked with her with tremendous concern and caring and sadness, mixed with a little bit of anger that her brother would do that, which I knew was the opposite of how her parents had reacted when she told them. Yes, she told her parents, and they just gave a flat reaction of, well, it's over now. What's the big deal? And as we started to dare to go into that story, a lot of the healing that happened for her was that I would give her the reactions that fit the behavior. I would give her the reactions that maybe you're having, even as you hear the story. What? Oh my God, that's awful. Well, maybe I prompted it. And I'd say, say all of that out loud. And she goes, oh, no, I don't want. I said, no, say all of that out loud. Because we have to get all those, irrational justifications out of us so that we can hear them and know they're not legitimate. So she started to say, well, maybe I wore something that, I shouldn't have, and it turned him on. And she'd look at me like, what? And I said, just keep going. Say all these things. Get them all out. Let's hear them. Let's hear. I mean, this is the stuff we don't even dare say out loud, but it spins around in our brain and has tremendous power. She said, well, maybe I deserved it. Maybe I hadn't been a good enough sister. And she knew that sounded bizarre too. That's absurd. No, people don't get raped because they're not a good enough sister. And she went on and on from that of just these reasons that she kept in her own head, never said out loud, because, these things have to sneak around in our head. And you've probably got some of them. I'm going to say that to all of the listeners. You've got some things sneaking around in your head that you wouldn't say out loud. Because if you did, they're going to all fall apart. Maybe women deserve to be sexualized. Maybe that's why we're here. Maybe that's the purpose of girls, of women. Maybe that's why God made us here. Maybe I'm here to take the edge off the sexual tension for men. All of these things came out of her mouth. And as she said them, and she's rejecting each and every one, incidentally, this is a professional woman, very educated. She's going, I don't agree with any of these things. And I said, yet they're spinning around in your head. Let's keep saying them all so that we can look at them. And then as we did that, I said to her, now, whose beliefs are these? And as we backed into it, not surprisingly, they would be the beliefs of her father. That's the only reason females are on the earth. They would be the beliefs of her grandfather. She said, I think my mom believed it too. And I said, maybe. Women are raised in this culture too. And from day one, we're taught these things too. People think, well, if a woman believes it, well then, I think, well, no, women were raised here too. We grew up here. And from even in the womb, we start to get these messages of, a woman's purpose, a man's purpose. And so all of these things needed to be deconstructed and examined. So let me tell you of another story. This is a story, and I'm going to call this woman, what should I call her? I'll call her Angela. This is a story of silence and sibling abuse. It's a little less common of a story, and so that's part of why I'm choosing it. Angela came to me and so mystified about why she ended up in a marriage that had been so emotionally, psychologically abusive, with a man who wouldn't talk to her, just wouldn't talk to her sometimes at all about anything, who wouldn't take responsibility, who was sneak drinking for years. And then when she found it, then he would drive with the kids in the car. So he was alcoholic, but when he stopped drinking, he didn't get any better. He continued to stonewall her, stonewall the kids, and she was mystified as to why she had stayed so long in this marriage before finally she got to a place where she felt she had the right to leave. And she struggled to tell me anything in session. I would say something to her and she would repeat the question back to me. And I said, are you aware that every time I ask you something, the first thing you do is you say it back to me? And she said, I think I'm buying time. I'm buying time. And I said, yeah, it would appear. And then we'd sit with these long silences. And I'd say, in a very gentle way, kind of joking, just a gentle humor, it's your turn to talk. As I'd be saying blah, 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 trying to understand what is the story here. And the way that I work with people is I don't expect you to come in and know your story. How would you know that? So I tell possible scenarios. She grew up on a farm. Dad was a very silent type. Mom was, very subservient. There were like 4 or 5 kids. And nobody crossed Dad. No one spoke. I asked some basic things like, who got to talk at the dinner table? Dad got to talk at the dinner table. She did not. She was to be completely silent. She knew that. When she was given a gift at Christmas time and she opened it and it was broken, she knew she was not to say anything. Nothing. And her mom, in a very nervous way, said, oh, I'll get you another one. I'll get you another one. And it was a special kind of doll that she had really, really wanted. She was like 5 years old. But what 5-year-old doesn't go, oh, no, and cry? Well, she knew she couldn't do that. Because the one time she'd complained about something, she'd gotten a horrible spanking from her father. And so as we continued on with the story, and it took a long time to get the story out because she wasn't allowed to talk. She started to tell me, well, really, I'm okay with my mom and dad. It was my oldest sister who used to beat on me. She was so mean to me, but she stayed vague about that for a long time. Finally, what emerged was her sister would, when mom and dad were out working on the farm, her sister would torture her and she would hide. Her sister was like 5, 6 years older and would beat on her and she would hide from her. And yet she was forced to sleep with her sister night after night after night because there weren't, they shared a bedroom. And if she touched her sister during the night, her sister would explode. And so she lived with that day after day after day. Now that sounds awful, I'm sure, to all of you, and it certainly does to me. But it was really hard for her to grasp what that did to her and that it truly was awful. Later, she told me how her dad complimented her that he could always count on that Angela was not going to talk to anybody. And he really liked that about her. And so that deepened it even more. Beginning to talk to me was no small thing. What I began to do with her, as I said, maybe if you move your body, because she'd always sit very, very still, very stiff when we were together. And I said, what does your body want to do right now? And her leg just started to shake and shake and shake and shake and shake and shake and shake. And now I'm going to go off on a tangent over here and tell you that another woman whose leg used to do that, she said, it's like my leg just knows something. And out would come another story. So when this woman's leg started to shake, I thought, okay, we're on to something. And I said, let your leg do what it wants to do. And it was just shaking and shaking and shaking and shaking. I said, let's get up and walk. Let's walk. And so we started to walk in my office. And we're talking about how it really was for her growing up and how terrified she was. And she started to tune into how deeply terrified she was as a little girl that her sister would kill her and nobody would care. And that there was no one to tell. No one to ever protect her. And we would walk and walk and walk in my office as she would tell me and tell me and tell me. And then an incredible thing happened. She had wondered forever, why was it okay that her sister acted out? Her sister could do anything she wanted. I mean, her brothers had special privileges, but not like her sister. Her sister was off the leash in terms of the stuff she'd do. She would do awful things, she'd get in trouble, and her dad would always cover for her, give her money, and when she got older, her dad was still doing the same thing. And yet, as the only other girl in the family, she had no rights at all. And then she remembered one time in adulthood, years ago, when her sister had gone in a little bit of therapy. Her sister asked her, "Did Dad ever touch you inappropriately?" And of course, my client at that time was in complete denial of anything wrong with her family at all. So she said, "No." And she didn't even say, "Why did you ask?" And she just shut the conversation down. And she looked at me. Now, again, this is a professional woman who knows that people don't ask a question like that without something behind it. As we dared to explore why her sister would say that, she said, "Oh my gosh, this begins to answer everything as to the dynamics in my family." And there was a release within her, finally, of, I don't have to keep my mouth shut. And she'd keep her mouth shut about everything. I mean, she couldn't have a conversation with anybody of any depth. I don't have to do that anymore. I don't have to stay loyal to these rules that were implemented in my family. I don't have to stay loyal to them anymore. I can have my own life. Let me tell you one more story. This is a story of a man, and I'm going to call him Steve, who, when I met him, was just nervous, anxious, felt very separate from his family, had this weird mixed reaction to his mom and dad. He said, "I just remember feeling so uncomfortable when I would go over there. And in fact, still I feel so uncomfortable in that house." And at first it sounded like his dad was abusive to his mom. So I said, "Is this what's going on?" I'd start to describe some things that might have happened. Like, "Is that?" And he'd go, no, that's not it. That's not it. It took a very long time until one day he was talking about his mother. And I said, "You have such disdain when you talk about your mom. There's just this look of disdain that comes over your face." And he said, "Well, she used to beat me with a belt. And she used to make sure that the buckle of the belt hit me when I was a little boy." And of course, that was just the start of the story. These things don't happen in a vacuum. It's not like, okay, well, that happened, but everything else was okay. The rest of the atmosphere of the house was just fine. It really doesn't work like that, people. If you have somebody who would, this was when he was 4, do that to a 4-year-old, yeah, she's a little goofy every day. And this had so given him a clear message, these beatings, that he was defective, he would forever be unwanted, unloved, and rejected. That he had simply married somebody, anybody who'd marry him, and had never felt loved. He truly loved his children, but he didn't know how to let them love him. As he unlocked really a love for the little boy and began to embrace him, his ability to allow others to love him also opened up. And people will say to me, "Well, I know I need to learn to love myself." And I go, "Well, I don't know. I think it'd be better if you allowed someone, even your dog or your cat, to love you and to let that in deeply." Often when I take somebody into an imagery which I'm also going to record an imagery where you can encounter your inner child. People will find they don't like their inner child because they have fully bought in to what they were told about themselves. I had one woman where I took her into an imagery with her little girl, and this is actually very common. And she didn't like her. She said, "Well, I don't like her. I don't want to talk to her. I don't want to get anywhere near her. No. I don't want any. No, she's gross and disgusting, and she's just bad." And this woman would never say that about any child. And so I said, "So you stand with your mom and dad." Well, now she knew her mom and dad were messed up and abusive. We had clearly figured that much out. And so then I had her picture herself standing with her parents against the child. That was disturbing. And then I let her sit with that for a while, because she needs to step out beyond even that image and look at that. Wait a minute, I'm standing with these people, my alcoholic father and my emotionally goofed up mother, and I'm going to stand against a child? No. That goes against my value system. I don't agree with that. I got to think about this again. I've got to come to a new decision about this. But as you can see, and as you know, it's no small thing to say, well, I am not going to keep these agreements so that I'm, quote, loved, unquote, by these people anymore, because I don't feel loved anyway by them. This is really powerful stuff. Allowing yourself to go to the emotions and even to the physical response that you have when you examine your background. Picturing yourself sitting at the dinner table and what happened for you at the dinner table. How was it for you at the dinner table? Isn't that interesting? So much of the dynamics in a family go to what happened at the dinner table. Who was allowed to talk? Who was allowed to have emotion? Who was valued? Who was not? Where did different people sit? And what did it mean? And then climbing inside of that experience at the dinner table. There are so many more stories that I could tell you, but this is probably a good start for you to begin to know your own story. Now, I will tell you that as you know your own story, as you dare to know what happened for you and dare to climb inside of it, there's a method that maybe I'll talk more about next time, called psychodrama. And I am a psychodramatist. And part of that method is called the role reverse. Not role play, but role reverse, where you climb inside of the image you have in your mind of the person that you have an issue with, a conflict with, a person who hurt you. And you see through their eyes what they're doing. I recently had someone climb inside her image of her father as he was saying these horrible, horrible things to her. And she gasped and said, "I'm enjoying it." Speaking as her father. To realize that her father was enjoying the pain on his daughter's face. She had never considered that. And I said, well, you don't do it, because it's not enjoyable. We know that people who inflict pain on others are actually experiencing a relief themselves, or they wouldn't do it. There's an enjoyment in the suffering as you impose it on a child, on a spouse, on a pet, on anyone more vulnerable than you are. So I hope this gives you some things to think about in terms of gathering yourself up and realizing that in climbing inside of your story, understanding it from more than one perspective, realizing that your reaction to yourself you don't actually agree with, And so you need to step even further out of the story. Let me tell you what I mean by that. So the woman who was rejecting herself as a child, standing with her parents, I later had her picture herself standing and looking at herself, rejecting the child. And she needed to develop compassion from that part of her to the part that was judging the child. And then, of course, go have a conversation with her. I mean, it's all about rerouting the brain through new conversation that goes on in the brain itself. Well, she had a beautiful conversation ultimately with the adult who was rejecting the child, saying, wait a minute, look at the things we know. Look at the things we believe. And the arguments back from that other part of her, which needed to all be spoken. Yeah, but anybody who has parents that would do that, she'd say, well, you know that's not true. You know that there are parents who reject their children. And they had those two parts of her had a great conversation. And then the part of her that was wise was able to help the part of her that was trapped in the belief that I have to stay here or I'll lose the love of my parents. She was able to help that part then go and actually apologize to the child and bring it together in a new, loving way. So I'm not saying that you guys are all multiple personality disorders or anything weird like that, but in the mind, it's like a great orchestra, and we need to get the instruments playing the same song in harmony. And so bringing all the different parts of you into it. So much more I could say, but that's a start. So I hope you enjoyed today. And then next week, I'm going to come back in the studio and I'll record an inner child imagery. You guys take good care of yourselves. Be very kind to yourself, please. Trying to find the love, the compassion that you would give to another and giving that to yourself. And remember to live with purpose, passion, and intention. Until next time.